obsessions, compulsions, what's known as the proliferating mind in Buddhism. What does Buddhism have to say about this? I had a recent question from a viewer who asks, "Hey Doug, I was curious on your take on obsessions and compulsions and how we deal with them. Do we observe from a distance and try to name them like most other negative thought patterns? Could you make a video on the subject?" Well, yes, of course. I would love to make a video on the subject. So what I'm going to do in today's video is first discuss how these ideas of obsessions and compulsions are really central to Buddhist practice. Then I'll turn to getting into some of how obsessions, compulsions, this proliferating mind, how it works, at least in an early Buddhist understanding. It's somewhat complicated, so all I can do is give something of an overview here. But, all I can do is give you the overview and you'll have to see the complexity for yourself. And then at the end, I'll turn to at least some potential practices that we might use in this regard. And the questioner here asks about one of these potential practices. However, before tackling this problem, I do want to make one important point, which is that obsessive-compulsive disorder, known as OCD, is a legitimate psychological disorder, and I will not be discussing OCD in this video. If you're having problems that might qualify as OCD, you should really get professional help for those, and I'll leave a link down below in the notes to a web page by the National Institutes for Mental Health in the US about OCD. Again, I'm not going to be discussing that kind of disorder here in the video because it goes beyond what I consider the heart of Buddhist practice, which has to do with what we might say are ordinary, everyday obsessions and compulsions, not the disorder itself. So, our minds obsess on topics regularly. For instance, things that cannot be changed in some way or other. For example, we may have some past regret that since it's in the past, we can't change the past, there's nothing we can do really about that regret, and so the mind obsesses on it. Or there may be some future occurrence that we're concerned about, that we either can't change because it's literally in the future and we can't do it yet, or because it's literally out of our hands. It's some future event that we can't do anything about somehow. And so the mind obsesses. And the other side of this, we feel compelled. We have these compulsions to act in various ways in order to sort of release the steam that's building up in us because of these obsessions, these obsessive thought patterns. Two of the major expressions of our obsessions and compulsions involve greed and anger. Greed towards wanting things to be a certain way in the future. We may obsess about something that we want to achieve, or anger at something that we have done wrong in the past, perhaps anger at ourselves, or anger at somebody else about something that's been done to us in the past. Anger about the future, about something that we feel is going wrong in the future. And all of this is involved, of course, in suffering, in dukkha. The whole process of obsessing about things, of feeling compelled to do things, is all tinged with dukkha, with suffering. Indeed, for many of us, this is how our minds work much of the time. In early Buddhism, this whole process, this syndrome, goes by the name papancha, or mental proliferation. And the Buddha had a diagnosis for how mental proliferation worked. It's somewhat complicated, but we'll try to tease out some of its major threads here. Perhaps the most famous description of the workings of papancha is in the Honey Cake Sutta, where the wonderful early monastic Mahakachana discusses how it works. This is what he said. Eye consciousness arises dependent on the eye and sights. The meeting of the three, that is, the consciousness, the eye, and sights, is contact. Contact is a condition for feeling. Now, feeling here, I should say, are basically pleasures and pains. Contact is a condition for, you might say, pleasure or pain. What you feel, you perceive. What you perceive, you think about. What you think about, you proliferate. What you proliferate is the source from which judgments, driven by proliferating perceptions, beset a person. This occurs with respect to sights known by the eye, sounds known by the ear, and so on, in the past, future, and present. So this is a very complicated passage here, and I don't want to understate that fact. So if you're confused about it, that's normal. It'll take a while for it to really sink in, and indeed a lot of practice is to see how this works in practice. But basically, we start with our experiences of the world. We open our eyes, we open our ears, open all of our senses, and the world rushes in. And what happens from that rushing in is feelings. That is to say, some things that we find pleasurable, some things that we find displeasurable, and of course a lot of stuff that we find neutral, which we'll sort of leave aside for the purposes of this video, just because there's too much to discuss. However, there's a critical point here, which is, Mahakachana says, what you feel, you perceive. And that is a very important point to pause on. What you feel, you perceive. That is, the feelings that we have about something color how we perceive it. So, for example, if something gives us pain, we perceive it in a very different way than if it gives us pleasure. Think, let's say, of people, a person. Two people may look identical to us, but if one of these people, let's say that they're identical twins or something, if one of them has hurt us in the past, we will see them in a very different light. Again, if the other one has given us pleasure in the past, has been kind to us, has helped us in some way, that again will color how we perceive them. We can think, of course, of people on the news. You know, a person may look perfectly normal, but if they've done horrible things, we're going to perceive them as ugly in a certain way. Similarly, or I should say oppositely, if they have done wonderful things. Then Mahakachana goes on to say, what you perceive, you think about. What you think about, you proliferate. And then these judgments, driven by proliferating perceptions, beset us in the past, future, and present. So if somebody has done something painful to us, our perception of them is ugly. Our perception of them is unpleasant. If we see them, let's say they happen to be a famous person on TV, we see their face, and that triggers a whole bunch of these compulsive, or I should say obsessive kinds of thoughts. Thoughts about the awful things they've done in the past, perhaps thoughts about the awful things that they might be doing right now or might do sometime in the future. The mind spins out. Or if somebody has done something pleasurable for us, we may see them as beautiful, more beautiful than we would have otherwise. We may be obsessed by thinking of thoughts about how to get them to do that sort of thing for us again in the future. We may, again, this kind of greed comes up as opposed to the anger we discussed earlier. This is the kind of a greedy mind, which comes up, let's say, if we have a potential new girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever it might be. We're thinking of ways to replicate or to have again the same experiences we've had before with this person that have been so pleasant. Now, notice that all of the discussions I've been having here about the way the mind works are essentially ego-directed, directed at getting something for ourselves or pushing something away from ourselves, directed at the way that these other beings influence us through their pains or pleasures that we might say, inflict upon us, or that arise when we experience them. In one early sutta, the Buddhas asked how a monastic should practice if they want to attain nirvana, if they want to attain enlightenment. And this is what the Buddha says. He says, they would cut off the idea, I am the thinker, which is the root of all judgments that emerge from proliferation. That is, the root of all of this obsession and compulsion, the root of all of this mental proliferation comes from these ideas of, we might say, self-protection, protection against pain, and self-aggrandizement, this tendency to pull things towards us that we like. Both of these, this self-protection and self-aggrandizement, are basically directed at protecting and increasing this notion of self, this notion of who we think we are, that I am the thinker, as the Buddha says. This notion that I am the thinker, I'm the thing inside of all of this that's doing all of this stuff, that's the heart of this continuing syndrome of obsessive and compulsive thought and behavior. That is, we want to kick out what we find unpleasant and therefore don't identify with. And we want to pull towards us what we find pleasant and do identify with. The alternative to all of this is to cut off this idea of I am the thinker in a very deep way. That is to say, to become aware of this process and begin to wear away at this idea of selfhood, of identification with things that we like, identification based on rejecting things that we find unpleasant. As we wear away at this kind of egoistic self-conception, the mind begins to calm down somewhat. We begin to overcome these kinds of obsessive thoughts about the past and the future. The Buddha discusses just such techniques with the monk named Malunkyaputta, and he says, in that case, when it comes to things that are to be seen, heard, thought, and known, in the seen will be merely the seen. In the heard will be merely the heard. In the thought will be merely the thought. In the known will be merely the known. That is, the Buddha is recommending a practice of simply sitting with the experiences themselves without the accompanying papancha or mental proliferation that ordinarily accompanies them. When this papancha begins to abate, what abates, what goes away, is dukkha, is our suffering. And this, therefore, is one route, or one way of understanding the route towards nirvana, towards the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering. This demonstrates the depth of the Buddha's understanding of our obsessions and compulsions. It also demonstrates the depth of the obsessions and compulsions, the ordinary ones themselves. That is to say, our ordinary obsessive and compulsive thinking, our ordinary ruminative thinking, it doesn't disappear until we finally become enlightened. In one way of understanding it, the very goal of the practice is to overcome this kind of obsessive rumination of the mind. So, to return to our original question of how we deal with obsessions and compulsions in Buddhist practice, well, in one way of understanding it, I think the deepest way of understanding it, dealing with obsessions and compulsions is the entirety of our practice. That's what the aim of our practice really is. So, for example, when we follow the breath in a samadhi practice, in a practice of calm and concentration, that is intended to, among other things, of course, calm the mind down in a way that reduces our ordinary mental proliferation. Once the mind is calmer, there's less mental chatter, less mental proliferation, less obsessive thinking. Also, we can think of a practice like one of loving kindness as directed against our obsessive thoughts involving anger. We can think of our practice of renunciation and of contentment as practices that are directed against our obsessive thoughts about greed. If we can become more interested in renunciation, if we can become more content with the way things are, we'll be less prone to obsessive, greedy thoughts. Further, our practice of mindfulness in general is a practice, among other things, or at least understood in this way, of seeing the way the mind obsesses. What do these obsessions arise from? What do these compulsive thoughts and actions arise from? As we begin to see them and understand them, and in particular, as we begin to see them as suffering, as painful themselves, we begin to relax around them. They become, at least in the longer term, they become less interesting to us to pursue. The mind goes towards them less as the mind begins to experience them as they really are, which is as dukkha. Now, part of our original question was also, do we observe from a distance and try to name these obsessions and compulsions like most other negative thought patterns? And indeed, naming these kinds of thought patterns can be one important practice. If we see obsessions arise, if we see compulsions arise, it indeed can be helpful to note them as such, to bring them to the mind as obsessive, as compulsive, and perhaps even with a smile on our face say, there's that thing again. This indeed, as I say, this can be one important way of practicing with these kinds of thoughts. And I think many of us who have long-standing Buddhist practices involving calming, meditation, involving ethics, involving wisdom, will see that these obsessive and compulsive thoughts begin to wane as our practice continues. It's a slow and long practice. It's not the sort of thing we're going to expect to see change in a week or a month, but over the practice of years, we will see them begin to wane somewhat. Another thing to keep in mind, this practice that the Buddha discussed with Malunkyaputta, some of us may find it somewhat reminiscent of a very similar practice, indeed in many ways the same practice, that the Buddha recommended to the wanderer from afar named Bahia. The Buddha gave a short description of the correct practice to Bahia, and that description of practice was so insightful that Bahia became enlightened on the spot. What is that all about? Well, it discusses in many ways the very thing we've been discussing in this video, the proliferating mind. I did a video about that, the discussion with Bahia, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to hear more about this whole topic. Thanks so much for watching. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page and seeing if you want to help support the channel. Could really use your support. And meanwhile, all of you, I hope you're going to have a great day, a great week, and we'll catch you on the next video next week. And all of you, be well.